known for all of you Zainab Badabi, sorry. It's a bit difficult for me at the moment because I thought how to start, and maybe we should start now after hearing so many stories with the stories of these professional journalists. And maybe Paul, who has almost similar experience of many journalists starting from in the 90s, and war and conflict experience will start with her story and with the information warfare, which I call not a war as information warfare, but information warfare as a war, if you don't mind. So, Paul, please tell us your story, your experience, how it was in those days and how it is now, and what is fake news, how we are trying to challenge that.
Thank you very much, Nino. It's really, well, firstly, it's really a privilege for me to be here on this stage with Zinab and with you, Nino. A great privilege. And I wanted to thank the President to permit us to talk about the press, about the freedom of the press. The President is doing a lot. She did a lot during the last week, and we thank her. I think in these times of uncertainty, it's very important to have a healthy press, to have freedom of expression, to go further and for people to understand really what's going on. So thank you. Et je voudrais vraiment saluer le courage et la détermination de la présidente de Géorgie, Madame Zurabichvili. Merci beaucoup, Madame. Well, Nino, actually, we could talk about that for hours. I was here in the beginning of the 90s. I covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. Zinab, you were watching it also from England. It was a totally different world. Right now, it seems like we are in kind of an impregnable kind of world where it's very hard to know what's going on because we have so much information and we don't really know, or it's very difficult to assess the credibility of what we have. There's a war in Ukraine that is probably the most publicized and most covered war in the whole history. And we have all kinds of videos, we have all kinds of fake news, and through all of that, it's very hard to be able to make sense of anything. When I was living in Russia, in Moscow, and covering what was going on, actually, everything that happened so suddenly. And of course, during the Soviet times, and many of you here could remember, it was really the realm of propaganda, the realm of propaganda. It was a super propaganda machine. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, the message also, they lost control of the message. And so for journalists, foreign journalists, but also local journalists, it was a gold mine because for the first time we were able to say what was really happening, and it was clearly happening. And I remember I was here in 1991 when Georgia fell into chaos in a way, and the access was easy because I could go and see President Gamza. I could go also on the side of the opposition. I could be in the street and see what was happening, and I was reporting it. And whereas now it's a totally different story because the message is controlled on both sides, and it's very hard to know what is going on. And last Saturday, what happened in Moscow, I mean, I was watching the BBC and I was watching France 24, And everybody was like, what's going on? And we had no clue because there was really, it's very hard to know what's behind the walls, what's the message, and probably it's the hardest for journalists to work in that type of environment. And just a little word, if it's hard for foreign journalists to cover these very difficult situations, just imagine what it is for local journalists to do their job. And I just wanted to say to local journalists, you're doing an incredible job and you have an incredible courage, because there's a lot of intimidation, there's a lot of harassment, and journalists have to face that and go beyond that. So bravo to these journalists that are working in the field in their countries that are victims of war.
And now I have to address to you. You are used to ask questions and hard questions in your hard talk and global questions. And it's not a global question. How you ended up, how you in this profession, how you came it, what were your challenges? Let's start with this.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam President, Paul, Nina, thank you very much indeed, and fellow delegates. It's wonderful to be with you in this beautiful city of Tbilisi. I think for me, very quickly, my family background probably meant that I didn't really see barriers anywhere as a woman, because my great-grandfather in the Sudan, where I was born, I left there when I was very little. As a 2-year-old, I went to the UK. But my great-grandfather was the pioneer of female education in the Sudan. So I grew up with grandmothers, great aunts and aunts who were highly educated women. And I think that my great-grandfather really was somebody who taught me very early on, although I never met him, that swimming against the tide and challenging orthodoxies, and that there were, stories submerged, the desire of women to be educated was, I think, a very formative experience for me. And so I grew up really not, thinking that anything was an obstacle in particular because of my gender. So I've worked in the media for 4 decades now, and I think our panel is about informational warfare. And so I just thought I'd share a couple of observations with you as to how it has changed throughout my several decades in the media. Informational warfare, really, there are 2 dimensions to this. As you were talking about conflict, Paul, so of course we know right from the time of the Vietnam War that the media is very important when it comes to war, and it's become a legend to say that, the My Lai massacre in 1968 turned the tide of public opinion in the United States against the war. And so I think ever since then, politicians, military leaders know that the role of the media is very, very important in how a war is conducted. As you said, Paul, we've seen that more recently, particularly in the Ukraine war. And you're right, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, did what he did last Saturday, it wasn't just the military threat to Putin, it was the fact that he really drove a coach and horses through Putin's carefully curated narrative internally that the war is about this, that, and the other. Somebody from his inner circle really upset that message very, very severely. So we know that there is always, a war for the truth, as it were. Recently, I interviewed one of the 2 generals who is fighting it out in the Sudan, rather sadly, in this senseless conflict. General Hemeti, not an educated man, left school at the age of 14. So I was interviewing him in Arabic, and every now and again he would stop, hear my question, and I could sense that on the line there were people around him who were telling him how to answer that question. It was going out on the BBC. So although he himself isn't a particularly media-savvy person, he is surrounded by people who understand the power of the media. The interlocutor I was working with to get the interview with him, Sudanese, but with a bit of an American accent, very media-savvy, aware of the power of PR. So I would say that today, you know, warfare is obviously conducted on the airwaves as well as on the battlefield. Then the other aspect of informational warfare is, of course, what might be called disinformation, or where people are waging, you know, discussions online in particular, where, you know, I say there are no more lies, there are only alternative truths now. When you look at what's going on in the media, it could be about COVID, it could be about climate change, it could be, you know, politicians trying to get their ideological base, you know, buttressed with their own arguments and so on. So there are these two things, one affecting conflict on the ground, and then one which is about, you know, all sorts of subjects. How has it changed for the journalists? When I first started, of course, the journalists really were the medium of information. We conveyed information to our audiences. But now everybody is a journalist because of the internet. As technology has advanced, journalism has really retreated because you know, we have citizen journalists. Something might happen in the world if there's, you know, a riot, or if there's starvation, a famine, or whatever, there'll be somebody recording it on their phone, which is a good thing in many ways. It isn't always bad because, you know, atrocities can't take place without people knowing about it. But I should say that before the internet, one big impact on the work of journalists in trying to convey information is actually rolling news, which came before the internet. So we saw in 1980 with CNN, when it was established by Ted Turner, you know, really laughed at him. They called it chicken noodle news, CNN, you know. And then after that, we saw in 89, Sky News. We saw in 1996, Al Jazeera. 97, the BBC's International News. 2005, France 24. So, you know, we've seen a huge proliferation of rolling news. And this has had a detrimental impact on the way we work, because huge pressures of time, you know, you don't have time to check your facts and find out what's happening. You're expected to comment straight away. So even if you, I mean, I haven't served on the battlefield, but I've worked as a reporter in conflict-ridden situations. And, you know, you might arrive in Somalia, as I did once, and you're immediately expected to be strapped to the satellite. And you haven't really had a chance to go around and gather information because of this pressure for, you know, constant commentary. And I think that has been detrimental, really. You know, even in the age of the internet, you don't have time to check your facts. You have to just, you know, there's no real wisdom imparted there. So I would say these two things, rolling news, the pressures it puts on journalism, and also the internet, have had a very huge and profound impact on the way that we have done our work. In some ways good, but in other ways not so good.
Thank you very much. And Paul, technology. We were talking about technological revolution. What do you want to say about it? Does it impact your life as a professional, as a journalist?
It's interesting what Zainab is saying. In the 90s, filing a story was very complicated. I remember I was on Rustaveli Street. I went to the post office. That was where I had to send the facts of the story I wrote for my newspaper. Could you imagine? So you write the story, you have to find a place to print the story, and then you go to the post office to fax it, and that was for print. And then radio, you were in some places where actually you had to go to the post office, but not just to the post office. You had to go and see the telephonist, you know, the woman that puts the wires in the wall, and you had to ask her to connect you to Canada, to Montreal, and you filed your radio story, and then the technical thing was so difficult, and sometimes I was so angry. I remember I was at the Iberia Hotel, and I was so stressed, I took the phone and I just threw it on the wall because it was going nowhere. So in certain situations like that, you cannot file a lot of story. Now it's incredible. I mean, on your little phone, you could write your story, you could file your radio report, you could do your TV 2-minute story. So it's incredible. But the boss in the newsroom, they know that. So the young journalists now, and Zainab know it more than any others, I mean, you see them, they do so many things at the same time, and like you've said, they don't even have time to check their messages, so they are overwhelmed. So the job is incredibly difficult for them now. Now I write op-eds and I reflect on things. My life is totally different, but if I was a young journalist today, I think it would be so much difficult. So, and it's very important then to have an editor-in-chief, a boss, the director of the information, a system that supports you to say what you have to say and to report what you have to report on. It's very important. So, technically, it's super easy now, and everybody can improvise themselves journalists, like Zainab said. But to do a quality reporting is very, very difficult. You are challenged on all fronts, and that's why credible media outlets, the BBC, in my country, Radio-Canada, CBC, the newspapers, anywhere are very important, and they have to be financed, these newspapers. They have to have the money to keep going, because right now the print medias are very vulnerable. They're vulnerable in Georgia, in Canada, everywhere. And of course, places like Georgia or, in the former Soviet Union, they are even more challenged. But it's important to have a quality press, a press that is credible, and that press is there. But, with all the information we receive, it's very difficult to keep this credible press at the forefront. And it's very important for newspapers, TV, radio, to fight for that space. And again, I repeat, it's important that they are financed adequately. And in my country right now, it's a big challenge, so I imagine here it's even a bigger challenge. And in these hard times, we need accurate information on what's going on.
And as we are talking about accurate information, disinformation, I'm not talking about misinformation, because we all make mistakes, but then admit them and correct them. But disinformation and propaganda is really dangerous. Do you think the newsroom could be changed somehow, let's say with the support system you mentioned? Do you have such a support system, Zainab?
Yes, I totally agree with you, Paul, that as I said, everybody's now a citizen journalist with a phone, which is a good thing because it means that atrocities don't go unnoticed. But it does mean that it puts a greater burden on the traditional mainstream broadcasters, such as the BBC that I work with. So, for example, when we were covering the Syria war and I was working on that, you get a lot of video footage coming in of atrocities that have taken place. Obviously, we do censor. We don't put out, I mean, there's always been censorship because we don't put out, very gory images, which people can get on the internet. But, so it was something that was saying that there was this atrocity committed by rebel soldiers. And that's how it was circulating. So at the BBC, we have teams of people. So, the BBC Arabic speakers amongst the journalists will look at this footage and they'll say, okay, these are supposed to be rebel soldiers who are committing these atrocities. They'll listen to the accent. Is it really taking place in Aleppo? They'll look at the car number plates. They'll look at the weather. Is it really taking place where it's supposed to be looking at? And they sit there teams and teams and teams of people looking at video footage to try to see, you know, what is genuine and what isn't. And unless they are satisfied, you know, regional accents, what accents are these people speaking in, they won't put it out. So yes, you do need more trusted sources of information when you have this bombardment of information on the internet. So I do think that the role, and I'm not just saying it because I've been at the BBC for a long time, you know, it really is something that we take very, very seriously, and we check our sources. We don't just put things out, you know, willy-nilly. And this goes on all over, you know, the civil war in Ethiopia that was raging until recently. You know, soldiers will put on rebel uniforms and do terrible things and say, look what the rebels are doing, and vice versa. So it's a very, very difficult world now to try and work out, particularly in conflicts, what's going on. And I should just say very quickly that it's a very dangerous profession now, covering conflicts, as you said quite rightly, Paul, particularly for the local journalists. And I mean, nearly 70 journalists and media workers were killed last year. And, you know, one really has got to salute their bravery, like you, Nina. I mean, Iraq, Afghanistan, Chechnya. I mean, it's a miracle you're with us today. You know, it's wonderful. And I salute you, because although I've worked in conflict-ridden areas, I've never been, you know, dodging the bullets as a war correspondent. And, but I say this, when I first started in television, you would get foreign correspondents who were British, who would be flown out from London to wherever. And they would arrive. And yes, they had impartiality, they were well trained, and you know, they could send reports, as you said, very slowly back to base. But today, I do think that the indigenization of news coverage is a good thing. So if there's a conflict going on in Nigeria, it's good to have a local Nigerian journalist. They speak the local language, they know the region well, and so although they are exposed to dangers, they are a little bit better at working out what those dangers, you know, are made up from. And I'm thinking of Marie Colvin, who worked for the Sunday Times newspaper, who of course died in 2012 when she was working in the rebel-held city of Homs in Syria. And, you know, she was actually targeted because she was based at the rebel-held media center. And she had gone on CNN the day before, pleading for humanitarian intervention to help the children in Homs. And of course, the Syrian authorities targeted that very place where she was. She wasn't caught in crossfire. So there are immense dangers and risks that people take to try to bring, you know, stories to the fore.
I agree with you, but I want to add that it is not necessary to be in the spot of the conflict to be killed. You can be killed with misinformation, disinformation as a professional. And what are we without our beloved professions to which we dedicated our lives? Is that true?
Well, yeah, it's like we've said, the challenges are immense. They're immense, but it's important to give inspiration to young journalists everywhere to continue, because I remember when I was younger, a lot of people wanted to become journalists, and now it's a very different world. The CBC, the Newsroom in Montreal, they have trouble to recruit young journalists. So yes, times have changed, the job is difficult, but it is fundamentally very important. And I really wish that governments would be, how could I say, self-confident enough in this place, everywhere in the world, so that journalists could do their job without fearing to repercussion, or without fearing intimidation or harassment. Or you go to a press conference, you do your press conference, you ask your question to the Prime Minister, and after the press conference, well, you know, we wish that the government will continue and let these journalists do their jobs. It's very important, and I I really wish that on that front, all government will be self-confident and responsible. I'm on a journey, I'm on a road trip right now, and I revisit the places where I used to work in the 90s. And I was in Riga, and I met a friend of mine who helped me to cover all the times of troubles in Riga in 1991. He became an investigative journalist for a newspaper in Riga. And a couple of years ago, he was reporting on a link between the mayor of Riga and a story of corruption between the mayor of Riga and some Russian person. And he publicized this, and he got into big trouble. And a couple of years after that story, he was sued, and he was assaulted, and he nearly died. And I didn't know this story, but when I went to see him last week, he told me all about it. And there was a big trial after that. He was immensely courageous. And in first instance, he lost his case in front of the court. And recently in Riga, in the Court of Appeal, he won his case. So freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the rule of law, an independent justice system is fundamental to be able for people to be able to have the accurate information and be able to make wise decisions. And this is a constant struggle, not just in the former Soviet Union, but also in Canada, also in England. We all have our challenges as journalists. And and investigative journalist stories are so important. And it demands a lot of courage to do a good job. And it demands also a lot of solidarity and from the journalist society all around these people and all around journalists. And that's why, you know, what you do, teaching young journalists to be brave, to know how to handle situations, to work together, is so important.
Thank you so much. And there is one big worry, which I think we should talk about. I know that we have just a minute to run, but how to persuade people that we are credible and the other source is not credible. Should we think about media literacy, talking to people about media literacy, about sources, or how to achieve that our credible information is reaching audiences which we are targeting?
I mean, I think that we do, as you said, do what you do, which is to train the young journalists and to make sure that it is a profession that thrives and survives, and to know how best to convey information. And I would say to them, it isn't just a luxury. You know, the Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the free flow of information, as Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, said, is a cornerstone of democracy. You need it. It's not just, you know, a bit of fun or whatever. It's fundamental to our freedoms. And Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning Indian economist, said there's no country in the world, he was talking a few years ago, that has had a famine where there's freedom of speech. You can use that in any other way, you know, a country where, you know, injustices, whatever they are uncovered, where there's freedom of speech. Because, you know, it is fundamental to having a proper functioning, you know, society. And I think that we must do everything we can to nurture those journalists of the future, as you do, Nina, and as you also are a great inspiration for Paul.
Do you want to add something, Paul?
I just wanted to say a few words to young women journalists here in the room. I don't know if there are many, but stay confident in yourself. I mean, if I reflect on my life as a journalist and I see my friends and I in the newsroom, guys in the newsroom, they were always confident. They would go in the office of the the editor-in-chief and say, you know, I want to cover this, I want to do that, that's my opinion. And, you know, there was this boy club or this boys club who, I mean, the guys, they go and have a beer after the day, you know. And us women, we're full of self-doubt. And often we say, okay, no, I'm not good enough for this, you know. Oh, no, I'm not ready enough to do this, you know. And I was in politics, and it's the same thing. Like young women in politics, they very much doubt themselves. So women, go ahead, you go, girl, and you're confident in yourself, and you cover that story, and you cover that story until the end, and you'll be the best.
Thank you very much. We are out of time. We can talk hours, and I'm sure the audience might be interested in our conversations, but deadline is deadline, and we know it better than anyone else.
This